Hello and welcome to this week's Niler 9 podcast. This episode is a chat with one of our pals, Liz Pelly, the author and music writer, who is known for writing critiques and essays about Spotify. Well, Liz has a book out about Spotify called Mood Machine, The Rise of Spotify and the Cost of the Perfect Playlist. It is a deep dive into Spotify's often problematic position in music and the music industry today. We're going to talk to Liz on our chat today about the outside influence that it has on the music industry, the gatekeeper effect on trends in music through its algorithm and editorial playlists, how Spotify emphasized the relationship between music and mood, the book being called Mood Machine. We talk about the vast collection of user data that it is collecting on the platform and how that metadata and data that it has built and shared with artists has led to artists chasing a more homogenous kind of stream bait pop sound. How Spotify has used fake ghost artists and their perfect fit content to reduce royalty rates and squeeze out real artists on the platform on their popular playlists. And it's a really interesting chat. It's all about, streaming now is dominated by Spotify, and there's a lot of negativity and criticism being lobbed at Spotify rightly in the last 6 months, especially for different reasons other than what Liz has been talking about. But Liz has been talking about and writing about Spotify for a number of years now. You may have read some of her work in The Baffler and seen some recent excerpts of the book in The Guardian. Now, Liz is kind of put all of this together in a book. The book is out this week. It's called Mood Machine. So let's chat to the author, Liz Pelly. It just occurs to me that a lot of what we talk about when we talk about streaming platforms like Spotify and everything, that the ecosystems that they create, they approach music as kind of a tech problem. They're like, it is approached not like art, but like as something to be solved. When you get a corporation like Spotify and they're trying to apply a lot of their mindset from a tech bro world to music. Obviously, that's something you've come up a lot with in terms of researching for your book. So Spotify started in Sweden. Obviously, the background for, the reason why it started in Sweden is interesting enough, isn't it?
Yeah. I think that what you're saying is, I totally agree, like totally accurate from my perspective assessment of the root of a lot of the, not just problems with the streaming era, but like the fundamental disconnection between the way music people might think of the value of music and, like you said, all of the different weirdnesses and issues that come up when you have this approach to music that treats it as a tech problem. I like that framing of it. I think also it's right to compare the way in which Spotify has impacted our relationships with music and the ideas about how people think of music and discovery with the way that the Suno CEO talks about music creation. Something that I really think is true about music streaming in general. Like I don't think that the problem is making music universally accessible or making it so that all the music in the world can be streamed somehow, or, quote unquote, all the music in the world. From my perspective, more of the issues come with the tech industry obsession with optimization and frictionlessness, and making it this like hyper optimized experience of you open the app and get what the streaming service thinks is the perfect recommendation for you at the perfect moment. This idea of frictionlessness, it's like the friction is sort of where sometimes connections get made, ideas are formed. Like there's this, I keep saying this in some of my conversations, but I feel like there was some sort of like convergence of tech bros somewhere that we don't know about, where they just like put their heads together and decided that people actually like hate having to choose what music they listen to. Like it's this like, they have this idea that people find it like unbearable to decide what music they want to listen to. And, as people who write about music, as music critics, like I don't think any of us would, agree with that. Like I think that people love finding new music and going through the process of looking up new releases and hearing other people's perspectives on new music and reading through them, deciding, well, I agree with this, I don't agree with this. Like that's why people love reading reviews, is because they love disagreeing with people as much as they like getting a solid recommendation from a trusted voice in music criticism. So I think this, this idea that people find it so burdensome to have to learn about new music is just like a total, tech mythology that they've created in order to optimize to their like business model.
But isn't that like the natural outcome of creating a program or a system that wants to keep you on it, the platform at all times? That's why we have algorithms now. The algorithm wants to keep feeding you. There's a quote in your book actually about that. The whole idea is, and there's a reference in there to TikTok as well. The TikTok feed is like, they just want to keep feeding you stuff. So it's like the idea of the lean back listening. You don't put any input in, you're just being shown things. And that I remember when Spotify, even last year, I think it was, they had their New Music Friday thing, and they have all of a sudden there was these like short video clips of the songs, and you're like, what's this? Like, that's not a way to consume music. And a big takeaway from your book is, the idea of the passive listenership, where that is a huge byproduct of Spotify's dominance. It is because Spotify is the biggest, 675 million users, whatever it is. We get this ecosystem which is, homogenized, and, a music ecology which is kind of this route one. It's been like, the book talks about how it's like been flattened or smoothed out. So it's this kind of one size fits all model. I think that's really resonated with me, because the idea that every artist, every musician is then put in the same pool and basically made to compete for attention. And obviously that's the wider world in which we live online now, and that is problematic in its own way. Artists feel like they have no choice in which to go into that ecosystem, because there's nowhere else that they can make the music other than in a live context. So you're getting all of these, the power of playlists. So can we talk a little bit about that? I guess, many people who listen to this will obviously be familiar with the idea of the Spotify algorithm playlists, the editorial playlists, stuff like that. But can we talk a little bit about how that has changed the makeup of how an artist thinks about things, and how an artist thinks about their art and where it goes then?
Yeah, definitely. I also realized I kind of dodged your earlier question about the roots of Spotify in Stockholm too. So just like, I think this fits together really well though, because, the book uses the story of Spotify as an entryway into what I describe as a story that doesn't begin or end with any single company. And I start by sort of looking at the rise of Spotify and how Spotify came at a very, very specific sort of political moment in Stockholm, wherein, the sort of post Napster years in Sweden, but the Pirate Bay had still really taken hold in Sweden, and looking at the specific way in which piracy existed in Stockholm, and the way the music industry started to sort of give up on the idea that people in Sweden would ever pay for music again because piracy was so rampant. So they were more willing to try a free tier in Stockholm. So I kind of look at this early history of Spotify and these early years when Spotify was developing this product that was really more sort of they describe it as they were trying to build a product that was better than piracy. They wanted to sort of just use advertising to fund a model that would give you access to all the music in the world, but instead of having it downloaded on your computer, you'd have it streamed through the internet. In the early days of, not just Spotify, but music streaming more broadly, Spotify wasn't the first music streaming service. These services really were more kind of search bars where you'd have to know what you were looking for and go look up a certain artist or a certain album. And in chapter 3 of the book, which is called Selling Lean Back Listening, that's a chapter where I try to sort of like chart this history of like, okay, when did streaming services or Spotify in particular shift from thinking of what they offered as this sort of full catalog where it was really just about like giving you access to, as they describe it, a world of music, to this more curated idea of offering you the perfect recommendation for every mood or moment, or, you know, when did they switch to this playlist system as we kind of know it today, or started getting to know it in the mid 2010s. I spent a lot of time just sort of like reading through Spotify's, you know, press releases over the years, looking at the homepage of Spotify.com and how it shifted, and was able to sort of pinpoint this like one specific moment in late 2012 when it seemed like the way that Spotify thought of itself really changed. And the homepage of Spotify.com shifted from, looking more like a standard tech website with information about how to subscribe, how to use Spotify, words like instant, simple, free, like access to music, to this kind of like brand redesign where at the end of 2012, their website became like moody images of like, you know, people with their loved ones in these special moments in their lives. It sort of looked like the early Instagram filter aesthetic of like, you know, people hanging out at a party. And it was kind of more about it seemed clear to me that there was some sort of shift where Spotify started positioning itself more as sort of like selling a lifestyle, or sort of like trying to get people to imagine themselves using Spotify in these specific moments. And according to some sources, so the book is a work of reported criticism. There's a bigger perspective. It's a work of cultural criticism, but there's also interviews with over 100 people, including a lot of former Spotify employees. And I was able to talk with this one person who was close to the company in those years when that shift happened, who kind of explained to me that there was this moment where Spotify actually commissioned a research agency to do a study on its own listener base to figure out how people were actually using the product. And they found that there were a larger percentage of users who were thinking of it more kind of like Pandora. They were thinking of it more like, I want to be able to press a button and get like a lean back feed of appropriate music for different distinct moments in my life. So, you know, it was really like 2013, 2014 that first shift towards curation, both hiring in-house playlist editors to curate playlists by moods and, you know, things like your favorite coffee shop or morning boost or something first started to appear.
Yeah, it's like music as a lifestyle background choice, you know. It's like and the book does make clear that, you know, there was always in history, as you point out, there was always examples of this kind of music as function, with, you know, even back to Thomas Edison in 1921. So that's something that you talk about in the book, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that was super interesting because, you know, something that I write in the introduction is that the story of streaming is as much about what's changed as it is about what stayed the same. And there's so many examples, you know, like in the past 10, 15 years of tech companies claiming to invent things that have already existed throughout history. And I think that something really interesting about streaming was the way that it was really pitched as this disruptive technology that was going to democratize music and level the playing field. And as much as I try to describe the ways in which streaming has changed music, I think it's equally important to look at the ways in which, you know, streaming has reproduced dynamics and industry practices that have always existed. So with the mood stuff, you know, it was a matter of kind of trying to trace a broader history of not just mood music, but music being pitched to listeners as a means of mood stabilization, or like the promise of being able to change your mood through music, which, you know, obviously there is some truth to it. There's music that I like to listen to when I am feeling anxious or nostalgic, or when I'm at the gym or something. But oftentimes I think that, one, you know, what music for each individual fits into those descriptions is so subjective. There's not really like one universal idea of chill music or workout music or something like that. And also there's just like this whole prehistory that I think is useful for kind of looking at the different ways in which tech companies have often turned to these ways of thinking about music when trying to sell new types of music technology.
Yeah, in a way, because it's we've had Muzak and we've had even new age music in the 80s, and like the easy listening idea. So it's kind of like we've taken easy listening to this grand global level now, where it's like, well, people want something. Some music to relax to, or they want some music to, like you said, the coffee shop morning, all this kind of stuff, all these moments that are part of it. There's a quote in the book which says the vast majority of music listeners, they're not really interested in listening to music per se. They just need a soundtrack to a moment in their day. I think Daniel Ek was the first person to really exploit that. So a quote from somebody you were interviewed. I also think that the core of the company's success was recognizing that they're not selling music. They're not providing music. They're filling people's time. And he said at a company meeting, I remember he was like, Apple Music, Amazon, these aren't our competitors. Our only competitor is silence. It's a fairly broad remit. It's like we're just trying to fill all of the noise. The rest is noise, but we're the noise too. It's like everything. There is no such thing as silence. Silence is a problem. Mm-hmm. Silence is our enemy. Like it's so. Yeah, that's the disruptive nature of this tech stuff where you're like, hold on, mm-hmm. What?
And that that quote from that source there to me really charted with some other ways that I had seen Spotify describe itself in its own advertising materials over the years. So by that, I mean, on the Spotify for advertising or Spotify for brands website, where Spotify's pitching itself to advertisers who they are trying to get to pay for advertisements on the platform, they'd always describe, the ideal sort of Spotify user's daily journey. And they talk about, this model Spotify user that wakes up and has their morning wake up playlist, has the podcast they listen to while they're making breakfast, has the music they listen to while they're doing yoga. Then they have their morning commute playlist, focus music they listen to at work, this podcast they listen to on their lunch break, more focus music in the afternoon, a podcast they listen to on their drive home, and then a dinner playlist and a wind down soundscape. And like their ideal listener would be someone who just their full day is like constantly soundtracked by Spotify in some way, because that gives advertisers so many different discrete moments in a person's day to try to advertise them. And it's sort of a way of seeing we're with people all day. Like no matter what moment of the day you're trying to target someone for your Charmin toilet paper advertisement, we've got the perfect moment. Or if you're trying to advertise someone Red Bull, we've got the perfect moment, something like that.
Yeah, it's I guess that's just the byproduct of being this massive global corporation now, who is like you say in the book as well, is probably charting and tracking every movement and click you make in the app as well, because a lot of what it does, it has so much data that it starts to try and use the data then to predict what you want to listen to, isn't it? And it's like it's like the gamification and the datafication of music as well, this nebulous thing, which is now like, well, somebody skipped that, or they liked that, they how your interactions around music, no matter how devoid of the context in which you might be listening to it, how that then starts to dictate how music is used on the platform, and then sometimes how that music is added to playlists and stuff like that as well. And I'm really interested in the idea of the you say the data driven stuff that they have, and I remember the Echo Nest back in the day before Spotify started using it. It was just like a really interesting website where it was like a word cloud of all these music terms, and you were like, okay, it's really, wow, this is like early days of music data online, and you're like kind of clicking around and you're kind of figuring out what it is. But now how that kind of has translated to, especially from an artist perspective, made or forced or subtly changed how artists even write music now. It's like, the idea that you have to grab somebody quick. Before this, obviously before TikTok came in, but like you're like playing the chorus being the first thing you hear, and like all of these, the idea of repeat plays and all this kind of stuff. It just again, it speaks to that kind of homogenization of the music ecology, the music that we enjoy. Like there's some good quotes in the book. I can't remember who says it. I think maybe it's Darius Van Arman, talking about that band Oneida, the Brooklyn Noise band, who's like talking about being a challenging, a great live band who make challenging music, and like the idea maybe that they were doing pretty well because of the music ecology outside of streaming would allow them to, people come to the shows, buy the CDs. They weren't making huge money, but they were making enough to do it. So, and then this monetization of streaming just kind of changes how, bands like that kind of, they just don't have the same outlets anymore, and how it flattens the idea that in your research and writing of this book, just in your day to day, like, did you encounter many people who were like just not aware of like Spotify royalty rights or Spotify and how it affects artists? Because that's something I think I find an awful lot, where people for many years were just like completely oblivious to the problem with streaming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's super interesting. I mean, I feel like when you're thinking about music fans, people who are music plays some sort of social role in their lives, I think if there's anything about the streaming era that people have been made aware of the past 4 or 5 years or so, it's that artists don't get paid super well from streaming, and it's kind of a growing awareness of the impact of the royalty system. But everything else that you just described about the collection of data and just, this in a very simple way, like what has the impact of all of this data collection been on listeners and on musicians? I definitely think that is something that is harder perhaps for musicians and fans alike to sort of unpack and make sense of, because like, especially when you think of, this question comes up a lot of like, what is new about this model and what is music industry business as usual, like taken to an extreme level. And I do think that in terms of like the daily collection of just so much data about both listening and music, it does seem to be like one of the newer dynamics that people need to sort of like step back and assess, like how it is subtly nudging them in certain directions, both as listeners and as musicians. You mentioned the echo nest, like it's super interesting thinking back to the late 2000s, early 2010s, especially as like, we both have roots in the world of music blogging. And I think that there was a moment where a lot of people, I mean, I know I first learned about Echo Nest because there was a Echo Nest hackathon when I lived in Boston, where there was also a panel about the state of music blogging. And as a music blogger, I thought that was super interesting. So I went to hear this panel about the state of music blogging, and it ended up being at the Echo Nest. Like there's an overlap because it's just all these different ways of thinking about contextualizing music online. So there is definitely like an approach to collection of data around music where I think it makes sense that people who are super interested in music could say like, oh, well, isn't this interesting? Like we have access to all of this information about the way people are listening. Can we parse out something interesting? Is there a way that we could use all of this data to make interesting recommendations to people and try to like get a sense of these big picture patterns about the way listening might be changing online? But when you take like, well, one, I think that even on like the fundamental level, like divorced from the business model, like it is really worth interrogating, like, are there consequences of that type of like mass scale data collection on culture? Like I would say, business model or not, like, yes. But then especially when you combine the potential to collect all of that data and glean all those insights on a mass scale with the business model that has certain aims of hooking people on the platform, growing engagement, boosting time spent on platform, and all of that data is being used to then achieve certain business goals, it becomes, I think, really, tricky and problematic.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the idea that artists, because of their engagement with this system, whether it's the Spotify artists, which showing you how many people are listening now, and the fact that it beeps in your hand sometimes. I think I was talking to Olaf Arnold last week, and he was saying it's kind of scary that, when you open this app, you can see how many people are listening, but also your phone buzzes every time someone listens, and it's like this gamification of this. Mm-hmm. The gamification of his art, and you're like, that's kind of bizarre. And he said a lot of days that's like the closest you will have to somebody who's listening to your music. Your closest interaction is seeing a number, and I think one of the points that you made in the book is about, how because of the dominance of the Spotify system in terms of the music promotion and discovery elements of the platform, you've got then a system designed with major labels in mind and independent music and musicians who are then being put on into the same platform and same levels and designed and put into the same considerations of this big major label friendly system. So your kind of route to success is we have to get hundreds and thousands of streams so I can make enough money to be, to do whatever. So this is it is engineered so that all artists have to go through this. If they're engaging with it, and if they want to make money, that they have to kind of and make enough to earn a living. Like, we're not even talking like a huge living. Is that, they go through the system, they engage with Spotify editors, they hope to be on a playlist, and it kind of lives and dies by this playlisting, which, echoes the past of radio playlists and stuff like that as well, where you're like, well, I really need to be on this playlist. And you get this kind of onset anxiety from artists about, their place in the world based off where they are on Spotify and their numbers and their monthly listeners and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So that's something I think is really very pertinent to me at the moment and the people that I'm talking to. And, what are your thoughts on that at the moment?
It's super consequential for musicians, the amount of data that they're being kind of presented with on a daily basis, and not even just the amount of data, but the reality that data itself is really shaped by Spotify's business goals. I think that is something that can't ever be stated enough, is when you are confronted with some metrics about your music, it's important to say, okay, well, what is the metric that is being collected? Why did this system decide that this metric was an important one to gather? Do I actually even think that this is an important metric to be measuring? What influenced the listening behaviors that shaped what this stat looks like? And, were the listeners, and, it's never, data is never, unbiased. It's super biased by both the creation of the system that collects it, and especially on streaming, it's streaming metrics, especially something like monthly active listeners, is basically a completely arbitrary number that is totally shaped by whether or not something happens to be on an editorial playlist. You might be getting a lot of listeners from being on a big editorial playlist, but it doesn't mean that they even have ever read your artist name or are clicking onto your profile or have any sort of meaningful connection with the music. It just means that it was heard. I mean, it doesn't mean that there's no possibility that someone made a meaningful connection, but it's not guaranteed. A high level of monthly active listeners could be because someone has enrolled their track in discovery mode, and as soon as they remove it from discovery mode, the numbers go back down. And I think we've obviously seen that in the streaming era. There's certain types of music that lends itself to high replay value, and certain types of music that does not get endless streams on the background, but doesn't mean that it's not music that a certain type of listener or fan base finds really important and interesting. And, it's
but that could also change how what is popular in music as well, and how the dominance of certain sounds and certain genres. I once remember a small record label, a guy telling me that, like, guitar music doesn't stream well, like, he's like, you're like, well, okay, so people are like, well, we shouldn't sign guitar bands because, they're not going to do well, therefore we're not going to make money if we're thinking about the financial aspect of it. One example in the book is that kind of speaks to the kind of homogenization and the passivity of the discovery and playlist stuff is this lo-fi beats scene. So, a lot of people would know the YouTube lo-fi beat scene and stuff like that, and lo-fi girl and all that stuff. So what happened is something you recount in the book is, the popularity of such music increasing so much that when Spotify starts to codify or create a playlist around this sound, which it has done a lot, and it did with hyperpop, you kind of get this bun fight from artists in the scene who are like, when they realize that they can make money from this, it becomes like the goal is being placed on the lo-fi Spotify playlist above all else. And what you hear, certainly from my experience anyway, is like, if people like Jay Dilla and Madlib were the source or like the influence for some of this music, the color and excitement and imagination of that music in the first place gets kind of drained, so that it all kind of has to fit into a background sound because it's going on a playlist that people will hear in the background and not pay attention to, and therefore, first of all, they won't know who the artist is. They may never stream that artist ever again off that playlist. So the idea that a meaningful connection could be made is then obfuscated even further, so that people are like, well, God, I just have to get on the playlist, and if it gets streamed enough times, I'll make some money. But there's no... So yeah, you get this kind of situation where people are making music not because they want to make music, but because they feel like, if I make this kind of music and this type of music, it'll feature on this Spotify playlist. And therefore, because there's so few other ways in which those kind of artists can make money, the ecosystem of like lo-fi beats, for example, becomes like very homogenized and very strict and rigid, and like it is designed for a background, listening and passive listening.
Yeah. And, when you wrap all of the value up in like these curators and the idea of a playlist or a sound, it really minimizes the role of artists as individuals too. Like, there's this quote in my book from this one lo-fi hip hop beats producer who says that today there's no such thing as a lo-fi artist anymore. There's just people who participate in the lo-fi machine. And that might seem kind of alarmist, but I think that it is, that should, I think that it's helpful to hear something like that, because in some ways it's like this seems to signal like what could happen to other sounds and musical traditions and genres too, if, this model is allowed to be taken to its fullest extent of its logic. The thing that I think is the most illuminating about not just lo-fi, but the whole section of the book where I'm talking about ghost artists, or what Spotify internally calls perfect fit content, this sort of like low royalty stock music commissioned to fit specific moods and vibes on background playlists, is it really like serves to, not cut out like the idea of the artist entirely. These playlists aren't about a connection between a listener and an artist. They're about a connection between a listener and a curated vibe. And I think that's kind of like one of the main points that I try to make in the book, is that like, it might seem like at first it seems maybe not like a big deal for these systems to be privileging or championing functional music, or to be like kind of like pushing these kind of like vibe-based playlists. But when the relationship that a listener has is completely just with like the chill morning coffee playlist, it really cuts out the role of the individual artists that are on that playlist. And what I always say is like, if a user develops a listening behavior that's shaped around the chill morning coffee playlist and listening to that every morning, then it doesn't really matter what artists are on it to them. And if artists decide to like protest Spotify over unfair royalties, doesn't matter to Spotify. They'll just put someone else on that playlist, or they'll just commission some stock music at a low royalty rate to put on the playlist instead.
Yeah, well, this is something your book has really discovered because, you know, the idea of fake artists is something that you've talked about before the book and something you've been researching. So can you talk a little bit about discovering this and what that actually meant? Because you did allude to it there, but just, you know, was it a case of these fake artists, these ghost artists for hire, are a result of Spotify's business decision in which they're trying to reduce their royalty rate? So obviously we have royalty rate reductions for these kind of ghost artists, there's ghost playlisting, and then you mentioned discovery mode as well, which is very much like artists themselves deciding to take a reduced royalty rate in order to promote their music on the platform. All of these decisions seem to be business decisions in order so that Spotify can reduce their royalty payout and therefore make more money.
Yeah. So like I mentioned earlier, you know, the book is like reported criticism. There are like many sections of the book that are just sort of cultural criticism, but there are two real like investigations that root the two halves of the book. One is this investigation into ghost artists, or what Spotify calls perfect fit content. And the other is this investigation into the emergence of new payola-like practices on Spotify and programs like Discovery Mode, where artists and labels are asked to accept a lower royalty rate in exchange for algorithmic promotion. But I think that, you know, you could really consider like both of these practices together, because they both lead to a situation where the Spotify user is being served music due to pre-existing commercial relationships that are made unclear, that are not clear. You know, the listener doesn't know that they're being recommended this song because this artist has accepted a lower royalty rate, or because of the existence of this PFC practice. So there's like the impact on listeners in that way. And then also, you know, the impact on the artists who are participating too. So the fake artist thing that, like you mentioned, you know, for almost a decade in the music business press, there'd been whispers of this. One of the first articles was in Music Business Worldwide in 2016. They had this headline: Spotify's making its own fake artists and putting them on its playlists for studying and sleeping and meditating. And they, from the beginning, pointed out how this was likely to impact artists who make jazz, classical, lo-fi hip hop, or ambient music. And over the years in the media, different music business writers would report on this, and Spotify always denied that they were making the artists themselves, but they didn't deny the existence of some sort of broader arrangement. So in 2022, there was an article published in DN, the daily newspaper in Sweden, where they were able to access some copyright documents and piece together that, you know, in their reporting, they were able to find that it was this really small handful of songwriters who were responsible for hundreds of artist monikers and thousands of tracks that had prime placement across first-party Spotify editorial playlists. So when I started writing my book or researching my book, I kind of knew that this was something to look into. And yeah, interviewing musicians, former Spotify employees, people who work close to the music business during the time when this practice was emerging, was able to kind of like lift back the veil a little bit. I also got the ability to review internal Slack conversations and internal documents to sort of piece together the reality of how this program or this practice exists at Spotify, which is that there is this small internal team of editors who look after these sort of more lean back background functional music playlists. And then there's this specific group of licensors, which are production companies that commission music from artists at, you know, lower royalty rates. And then Spotify refers to this music as music commissioned for specific moods and playlists with improved margins. So, you know, there's some sort of cost saving program there. They license the music from the production companies at an improved margin. And then it is, you know, placed on their playlists for it's not like Spotify always doubles down on this. Like, it's not like any contract in their telling of it guarantees playlist placement, but from what I was able to review and the research that I did, it definitely seems like there is some sort of privileging of this material.
Yeah, and like you say, their playlist monitoring tool has what percentage of the playlist is perfect fit content PFC. So you're like, I mean, that's fairly telling of like, even if it's not explicitly said, it's definitely encouraged that you should be filling your playlist with as much of this reduced royalty as you can get music as you can get away with. And then is the other aspect of it, the creation of this music where, artists themselves are being bundled out of that royalty rate completely. They're giving a once-off fee in which to create the music. Some people maybe feel grateful at that for at first, but then you kind of see when these tracks, when you realize how many streams and how much money is being made from, the work that you've created, you're kind of like, it starts to feel like true exploitation in that way.
Yeah, it's interesting because there is this whole pre-existing history of musicians having day jobs making library music or production music, like music that gets produced, tracks that get produced to sort of exist in these libraries that people will use in the background of films or advertisements or TV shows. Like, it's not like this idea of artists generating these big catalogs of lower royalty tracks for the purpose of them being used in the background of media products is fully new. But there definitely are things about it that are new, and that like I describe it as a sort of context collapse in music where, this music made for this specific purpose is on the same platform with music made for all these other purposes. And you can tell that the musicians participating in this practice have weird feelings about it. Like, the reason why all of the musicians, so I interviewed a bunch of musicians for my book who make this music. And part of the reason why I wanted to make sure that their voices were in the book is to show that, like, these aren't scammers who are trying to like screw over other artists. Like, they're mostly just people who are trying to figure out how to make a living. And this is one of like many gigs that they piece together. But at the same time, most of them did not want to go on the record with their names, not just because they didn't want to risk losing the gigs, but because, at least for some of the people I spoke with, they found it to be shameful that they participate in this practice and they weren't particularly proud of it. So I think it does sort of like drive home that there is something a bit different than like, the historic example of a musician who their day job is making, soundtracks for movies or advertisements or something, which I don't think anyone would find particularly shameful or embarrassing.
But then you mentioned as well that there were some artists who were doing this kind of stuff that were required to release music under their own artist name as well as part of this deal.
Yeah, it's what's super interesting about it. Like there wasn't like one set model of what a deal or a contract for making this type of music that ended up being considered PFC looked like, depending on which company a musician was working with, because there's this sort of like list of like various different production companies that participate in this broader scheme. And depending on the company, their relationship with the musicians that they commissioned looked different. So yeah, some of them were, cranking out dozens of tracks per hour and putting different artist names on each one. And some of them, it was just sort of like they were getting these sort of like example playlists of music that they were then supposed to like compose bespoke music to fit the vibe of the playlist that they were sent as a reference. And they all described it to me though as like way similar to making music for to an advertising brief than necessarily like, just
like music on spec for a particular purpose, or vibe,
Which is super interesting. In the introduction, I talk about part of the story of streaming being, or this part of the story of Spotify being the way in which the practices of the advertising industry have been sort of imposed on music in new ways. And I definitely think of this as a primary example of that. It is a direct example of these norms of the advertising industry sort of being folded into the music
Yeah.
business in different ways. I mean, obviously, the music business as a whole, in some ways, is an industry of marketing and advertising as well. But this does seem kind of new in some ways.
And then we go back to some of the data stuff as well. We talked about, in the book, it talks about hyperpop as this kind of like culture that exists, but in Spotify's understanding, it doesn't really start to exist until it essentially has enough data. Spotify has enough data to create it and make it legible, and then a Spotify playlist is created, and kind of similar to what happened with lo-fi beats as well. It kind of its inherent biases of the playlists and the editors and the people who are making it. Like you say that, it says that some of it's for the most part, the producers that were added to us are straight male and cis, for example. So a lot of, there's a lot of trans community, trans influence in the kind of music that we're talking about here with hyperpop and stuff like that. So it's like the internal biases end up on the playlist in a way, because it's like, that's what happens with some, whether they mean it or not. It's like some of people are kind of discarded, and then the playlists become more homogenized again, and it's like then you're getting this, as it was described in the book, these SEO optimized version of a genre, not the actual wild and freeing experimental version of the genre that actually truly exists in the world.
Yeah, that part of the book was so interesting to research, and I definitely recommend, like, if anyone's interested in the history of hyperpop, something that was really helpful to me in understanding the history of the genre and also the way in which it had been impacted by Spotify was this YouTube series called Hyperpop Origins. That's like a 4-part series that is super, super in depth. I kind of describe it as like a people's history of hyperpop. The person who made it, Noah Simon, interviewed like dozens of people who were involved in the early hyperpop scene, and then traces like the impact that the Spotify playlist had on hyperpop as a concept and the major label gold rush that sort of like surrounded the playlist. And I was able to interview Noah Simon for the book, and also Umru, who is sort of a producer who has kind of been involved in both what gets called hyperpop and PC music, and also, does a lot of other production and live party production in New York as well. So that was super interesting. Yeah, I think it's this great example of how, in the streaming era, you have these like multiple examples of, a scene that exists online that is originally aesthetically diverse. Hyperpop starts out as this like sprawling scene with lots of different sonic influences, people from like around the world participating, lots of different little like smaller digital labels. And then you have this, in 2019, around the rise of 100 gecs, who sort of kind of get like pulled out as this exemplary of the sound. A specific idea of what hyperpop is starts sort of like coalescing in the Spotify data. They create this playlist that then in some ways sort of like starts telling people, what hyperpop is, that is sort of warped and sort of like, a particular idea. And similar to like lo-fi hip hop, yeah, like you mentioned, it has this kind of like homogenizing force where, I think there's this quote from Umaru that was a really good quote in the book, saying how the Spotify playlist sort of made it the path of least resistance to become a fan or a listener of the playlist and the specific idea of like a specific sound. Like it made it the path of least resistance to be a listener of a specific aesthetic and not really take the time to learn about the individual artists on that playlist.
Yeah. And that's something you talk about actually with the part in the book where you're going to the Spotify sponsored live events and you're talking to people at these gigs and you're like, you know, they know that they're into aesthetic rap or whatever it is, and but they don't really like, they find it hard to like maybe talk about some of the artists and the kind of, you know, for me it's like when you aren't get really interested in the scene in a traditional sense, like when scenes were like local and based in geographically placed, you're like, there's things to discover, but you're actually just into a vibe. Like the vibe is what's important. So you're like, oh, I'm into this vibe, so I'm here now, you know. And it does speak to the wider, like you say in the book as well, as like how, you know, TikTok has affected our the pop culture brains, and how, you know, the kind of things that suddenly get popular and capture people's imagination. Like we had I always think about the sea shanties from the pandemic era, let's call it, and you know how, you know, these random kind of ideas, or the ideas in pop, in culture, as like the trad wife or like whatever it is all these ideas that permeate through TikTok and then end up feeling their way onto culture and music in a way that you're like, I wouldn't have thought that was going to happen.
Yeah.
So yeah.
No, I kind of like, I think of it as sort of a result of what happens when like these whole ideas of a culture or a scene have to get distilled down to a specific like metadata tag. And it's really interesting because I think that something that can be kind of like an instructive comparison is to think that like, you know, in some ways what we're talking about is like the attempt to sort of describe a scene. But I think of what you mentioned earlier, you know, there's this quote in my book from this one media theorist who says that we seem to have entered a time where you don't exist unless you're data, unless there's enough data proving that, you know, a scene is like legitimate, or that there's like enough growth around a scene to have a datafied representation of it. But if you compare it with like the ways in which journalists, for example, or like people who are music writers try to describe scenes historically, like, you know, if you're a music journalist who learns about like a local underground scene and decides that you want to like write a piece describing the scene, like the work that you'll do is like, okay, well, who are a handful of artists from the scene? Can I reach out to them and talk to them? Can I get their ideas of what the scene is? Can I piece together like, you know, a story? Like there, in some ways, there needs to be data, because if you're like, well, I want to write about the scene, your editor will be like, okay, well, do you have at least like 3 or 4 examples of someone who is exemplary of that scene? If you're like, no, I only have one, then an editor would probably be like, well, there's not a story. So if you think about like the type of support that you need in order to like frame a story around a scene anyway, like there always is some sort of need to kind of like connect those dots. But it also requires like, you know, a lot more conversation, understanding, like making sure you're getting to the truth of the story, making sure that like, you know, what you hear, what your idea of what the scene might be tracks with what the people who are participating in it have to say about it. That's so different from just like, oh yeah, there's like a blip in this data cluster map that seems to suggest that people who listen to this also listen to this. So yeah, that's enough data for us to say that like this music all fits underneath the same umbrella. Like we're going to stamp this with this data label. You know, they're just like completely different. They both are like ways of telling a story about a scene or a genre that involve, you know, practices that probably some people involved with music would take issue with or not want to be part of. But I think they're also just like totally different ways of thinking about storytelling and context.
Yeah. So, I mean, your book is out in America now, in North America, right? It's out shortly here in Ireland and Europe. What has the reaction been to your work? I mean, it's something that you've been obviously writing about for a number of years, and in many ways, you're known for writing about Spotify and streaming. You know, so, but yeah, specifically since the book has come out, what kind of conversations are you having with artists and people who have read it?
It's super interesting. I have been having many conversations. I think something that the response to the book has been really made clear for me is that, you know, maybe something that would have previously been seen as like more of a niche conversation, being concerned with the impact of tech companies on listening and artistry, the intersection of the music industry and the tech industry, clearly is not a niche topic of conversation anymore. Like I've been having conversations on also not just on like music and technology shows, but all sorts of more generalist media outlets and podcasts and things. And for me, like one of the challenges of writing a book like this was trying to both write something that would be interesting enough, revealing enough to people who have been following this conversation for years, who are sort of the invested readers of the music tech criticism sphere, and then also something that is like accessible and general enough to be interesting to someone who's maybe never thought about these ideas before. That was kind of my thinking going into it.
Yeah.
And I think that, hopefully people are finding that the balance was struck.
Yeah, I think so. But the book is also arriving at a time when there's quite a lot of negative press beyond the scope of your book in terms of like Daniel Ek and what he is, investing in, and then, sponsoring, Trump inauguration stuff. So for me, it's been really interesting because like a lot of people I know who were on Spotify happily and who were probably aware of a lot of these issues now are suddenly going, okay, actually, I really need to get off Spotify now. I really need to go and do something about my presence there. I'm sure the other part of this is, because of the sheer popularity and kind of the monolith filter that Spotify has become, I'm sure artists, what are you feeling about artists participating in this model from now on or longer term from here after learning about this? And it still seems like there's generally people are looking for something different.
Yeah, I think people are definitely looking for something different. There's not one point in the book where I'm like, everyone should delete their accounts and artists need to abandon streaming, because from my perspective, that sort of organized boycott should come from a mass movement of artists or a union or some sort of solidarity organization. As an individual, I don't personally feel like it would be effective for me to even be suggesting that. And I also think that the sort of theory of change maybe that I outline in the book equally looks at ways in which the streaming model could be made less exploitative for musicians and listeners, as much as I look to kind of alternatives that might be built and are being built from the ground up. I think where the book lands shows the things that I am the most excited about, which is, it lands with talking about the role of public funding. I talk about in Ireland, the basic income for artists program that was piloted, and, talking about how a lot of the problems of streaming are problems of the consolidated corporate music business more broadly, and how, maybe it's not even just that we need to be thinking about fixing streaming, but we have to think about how do we actually want to support music culture in our societies, and what are other ways of doing that. I spent a lot of time talking about, I probably talked about this last time I was on your show too. I spent a lot of time talking about public libraries that have launched local music streaming programs. And that research made it into the end of the book, because, it's when we're talking about Spotify and streaming, the streaming model more broadly, it's you're never only talking about technology. It's technology plus the ways that power and economics and, the corporate music industry in this case, inform that technology. So I do think if you just look at streaming on its own, it's is the problem the idea of having some music on a central server and individual people from their computers being able to access it so they don't have to have files on their computer? I don't necessarily know that I would say that that is the problem in and of itself. I think it's the way in which, music industry practices and music industry consolidation have shaped that model.
Yeah, and it's how music moves through the capitalist system now, and how, you know, we all like often end up ending conversations with, we all need to touch grass, but we also need to touch grass like in terms of like metaphorically and like musically and all that kind of stuff as well. It's like, you know, we had, obviously there was a few years there where, you know, people weren't able to do shows and go to things, and we're still feeling the effects of that. So it's really like encouraging these local ecosystems. And I'm seeing a lot, I'm just seeing like with terms of like artists and streaming, and I'm seeing a lot of like people opting out more. And I think that's really good, because I think the more the less we rely on this any sort of monoculture, then we're culture is more beneficial, and art has a chance to grow in ways that are, you know, not immediately recognizable, but also, you know, perhaps exciting. And that's, I think, what we're kind of missing now, when so much of what what music is, how music is happening through one platform, and it's dictated by Spotify editors no one knows the names of, or people don't know who they are, or, you know, their own predilections, or people's own, you know, like you're saying, when it's not clear what the motivations are, why you might hear a single song in a single day, then there's reasons, you know. It's like, I mean, you know, people are always asking me like, what should I look at? What's good? You know, so I was like, well, just, you know, you can always support people on Bandcamp, and, you know, there's a whole swathe of new platforms being developed as well, that are like Nina, and there's Subvert and all these kind of things that are, you know, interesting. They're trying to answer these questions in a different way. So I think it's important to remember there is always an alternative out there. There is always, but somebody has to be brave. Somebody has to be kind of like, okay, I'm going to decide now, or like you said, get together as a group and decide what you're going to do collectively, because collective action is probably the best way, like you say, to kind of address the issues that we have.
Yeah, and like, you know, part of the reason why there isn't like a moment in the book where I just say like, delete your accounts and like everything will be better, is because it's obviously not that simple. And I feel like it almost kind of like, you know, I'm not trying to offer any sort of like neat solution, because I do think that, yeah, you know, the point is to hopefully motivate people to be like more curious listeners, and to be more critical of the media environment more broadly, to have a sense of like media literacy that they bring to streaming, and to also realize that like imagining alternatives and the work of building alternatives isn't going to be as easy as just like download this app instead of this app. It's thinking more broadly about, you know, collective culture. It's thinking about supporting music on a local level. It's thinking about kind of like new models entirely, and to just have a moment where you suggest like, you know, yes, it's, you have to, I mean, if people read the book and they decide that they want to get off streaming, I'm obviously not upset about that, because personally in my own life, like I don't use streaming services besides Bandcamp, which, you know, is a tech company also. And because of that, I'm excited by the various different projects that are emerging right now to sort of like imagine alternatives to Bandcamp too, like, you know, the Subvert and Tone.audio, Merlot, Nina, you know, all of these different, I probably forgot to say one of them, sorry, but there are a lot of them actually, like people who are working on alternatives to Bandcamp, which I think is really cool and interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Okay, well, Liz, your book is doing really well, and it's out in Ireland and Europe, UK. So thank you for your time. Always good to chat to you. Liz spent some time in Ireland. How long ago was that now?
It was 15 years ago.
15 years ago.
I started as Nyler Nine's intern.
That's right. Well, way back.
Way back in the day.
Yeah, in Smithfield, when I lived in that apartment there. Fair play. Well, look, it's great to talk to you again, and great to see you doing so well. And I'm delighted that things are going so well for you. And no doubt we'll see you soon, and we'll talk to you soon. And yeah, thank you, Liz.
Well, likewise. Appreciate it. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. Hopefully see you soon.
Thanks for listening to the 909 podcast. If you like what we do, why not consider supporting us at patreon.com/909.